Thank you very much, Gayle Smith, for being here. We are very honored to have you here. You're here as the representative, as the president of the ONG,
yes,
this global organization. Can you tell to our audience, which is mostly French-speaking, what is it exactly?
So, well, thank you also for having me. The ONG campaign is an advocacy organization, and so think of it as a political campaign with no politicians, right? We're campaigning for the issues. Our focus is really one that is about equity and justice. It's about ending extreme poverty and preventable diseases. We focus primarily on Africa, and we have offices in Africa, in Europe, a terrific office here in Paris, and in North America. Mm-hmm. And so we try to get governments to make the right decisions.
And you are succeeding in that?
In some cases, yes. I mean, I've served in government 3 times, and when I was in government, the ONG campaign was one of the organizations that advocated to me. And I found it to be, and still believe that it is, a very effective organization because it does a few things. We mobilize people's voices, so we're not just speaking for ourselves. We've got supporters and volunteers across all the countries where we're present. And we both push decision makers to make the right decision, but we give them credit if they do the right thing. And recently, for example, we have been focused on what's called the replenishment of the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and malaria. We've made huge progress towards ending those diseases, some setbacks during the pandemic. And we didn't quite get to the target, but we did work, I think, effectively with governments to mobilize over $14 billion to fight those diseases over the next 3 years. So that's good.
The money coming from private or government?
From public. This is predominantly government money. So we advocate to the world's major donor nations. So the G7. France is obviously a very prominent donor nation. The United States, Germany, the EU, and others. And then we sometimes focus also on the kinds of resources that are put on the table from, for example, the World Bank or the regional development banks. It's that money that goes into both humanitarian spending, but on development and economic well-being and growth.
And you started as a journalist in Africa.
I did.
What was your background?
Well, my background was neither journalism nor Africa. I had studied in college, I had studied English and mathematics, and I wasn't quite at all sure what I wanted to do. Like many people, I had the good fortune to travel, and I became more and more curious, and by a number of circumstances ended up in Africa. I was in Egypt for a year, and then I was in Sudan. And I became a stringer for the BBC, and I fell in love with the issues and the storytelling, and being, at that time, a radio reporter, and then I did print reporting also.
And do you believe that journalism has evolved, has changed in between the time when you started and now?
Yes, and I worry about it a bit, to be frank. Well, there's more of it, right? There are many more outlets and many more sources of information, and maybe that's a good thing. I think, and maybe I'm speaking a bit more to the United States than some other places, I think we blur the lines a little bit between opinion and journalism. And maybe spend a bit too much time on what opinions are or on a particular political point of view. It may be interesting, but I don't think it should be the dominant story. And I'm not sure we spend enough time telling the stories that people need to hear to understand the world we live in.
And you're present also on the social media. Is that a good thing?
I'm somewhat present. I'm not as active as some people. I don't find that there are enough hours in the day. Look, I think it can be a hugely valuable tool. I use it, I look at it. It's where I go if something happens. We've got news today of a potential coup in Burkina Faso. So you get on social media and you look to see what's happening and if you can find anything. I think there are dangers in the fact that it's largely anonymous. and that
it's somewhere sometimes very far from the truth what you read in there.
it can be far from the truth. It can be very mean-spirited. And so it's mixed. I mean, I think there are advantages, but I think it's mixed.
So you were also, how did you jump from journalism into being special assistant to President Clinton?
That's a good question. It was an odd leap. I mean, there was a jump in between. So I was working as a reporter. I covered the Horn of Africa, and quite a bit that meant covering Eritrea and Ethiopia and the wars there during the period of Haile Mariam Mengistu, or Mengistu Haile Mariam. And during that time, the big famine in 1984-85 broke out. There were not many people who were aware of all the contours of the wars. And so I shifted from reporting then. I went to work for a number of non-governmental organizations, mostly European. Bill Clinton was elected. I was, at the time I heard from the administration in Eritrea, and they asked whether I would be willing or interested in joining the Clinton administration. And to be honest, the first communication I got, I thought one of my friends was joking with me. I was like, who is this? And it, in fact, wasn't one of my friends. So ultimately, I did accept a position in the Clinton administration. And it was fascinating. It was really, really interesting, you know, to be on the outside of government and have views of how government works, and then to be in government and see how it works from the inside. It was a wonderful experience.
Is it true that when you're inside the government, you see how difficult it is to keep things moving, or to keep some ideas of materializing?
Yeah, you see that it's very difficult because it's not linear, right? So if you are on the outside, and if I'm saying, do more to end HIV/AIDS, it's a very linear, do more on this issue. When you're inside the government, you have to balance all the demands on the budget, what other departments and agencies want to do, what the politics are with the legislature. There are a number of factors that have to be woven together to get the decisions made that you want. And then you have to become a pretty good operator to figure out how to move all those pieces in the right direction to get the outcome that you want. So it's challenging. It's not easy, but it's a pretty great feeling when you can get something done.
Yes, and at that time, did you have a lot of money? Did administration spend a lot of money on these problems?
No, I don't know that we've ever spent a lot of money when you consider what the need is and what some of our other budget lines are. When I first joined government, it was at the end of the Clinton administration. And we were facing a situation in Africa where our embassies had been bombed. There were wars in Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Democratic Republic of the Congo. It was a period of tremendous violence and conflict. And stretching the resources was a difficult thing to do. So it wasn't exactly flush. It was a lot of time spent on trying to bring some of these conflicts under control, but then doing some other things. I mean, one of the things we did at the time was called the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which was the first piece of trade legislation between the United States and Africa.
And what was the purpose I see, but how did it work?
It was basically a preference program that a number of African countries would have preference to get into the queue, excuse me, to start a trading relationship.
Tax deductions also on customs?
Excuse me. Some benefits on that front for special products, but it wasn't like a full-fledged free trade agreement. But it was the first, for the United States, it was the first opening in terms of trade, trying to increase trade between the United States and Africa.
When we speak of the National Security Council here, we think of the most powerful organization in the world. How was it for you arriving in such an important place?
Daunting. I mean, one of my bosses, I served on the National Security Council twice, in the Clinton administration, then in the Obama administration. And someone senior to me once said that every night when you leave, if you look back at where you're working and are not somewhat in awe, then it's time to go, which I think is a good message. The National Security Council it means two things. The council itself is the members of cabinet that are on the national security team, and then it is the president's staff on national security issues. And it's serving the president directly. It's coordinating the various government agencies, setting and driving policies. It was a fantastic job. It was a very supportive environment. And people really were very good to each other. We forged a really strong team, I think, in both times I served there. But you have big decisions on your plate. And I think one of the things you learn, and it's not that hard to learn, because if you're working for the President of the United States, you want to make sure everything is clear and you've run all the traps and you've got all your facts right. But it does force you to do that and then tee the options up or the proposals up or the decisions up to the President of the United States.
And at that time, on which question did you focus on?
Well, in the Clinton administration, I was the senior director for Africa. In the Obama administration, a new office was set up on the NSC that was on economic development, humanitarian response, and kind of governance and democracy issues. So I ran that. And we had a number of big things. We had all the continued work on things like HIV and AIDS and so on. But at the end of my time at the NSC, I was one of the leads on the response to Ebola and all of the humanitarian crises in between. Syria, droughts and famines around the world, earthquakes, I had all of those. But on the development side, we were able to do a lot of, I think, important work, something called Power Africa, which was an initiative to double access to electricity in Africa and really drive investment, particularly in renewables. President Obama took the lead on food security. You know, we're having a food security crisis now. There was another one in 2007 and 2008. And President Obama took the lead then in getting countries to triple their assistance. We launched a huge effort on food security, which was also under my purview. So it was a combination of crisis response, but also some really big affirmative initiatives and policies aimed at improving conditions kind of from the ground up.
And
It's great.
What were the differences between working with President Clinton and with President Obama? Is there a difference in the way they work?
Well, they're very different men, but I think what I would point to is something they have in common. They're both extremely intelligent and curious and ask really good questions. So they keep you on your toes, which was a really, I think, important thing. I served only a short time in the Clinton administration, 2 years. I served all 8 years of the Obama administration, both at the NSC and then USAID. And they were both, yes, they're different. They were also different moments in history, obviously. I mean, President Obama was a historic president in many ways. It was a huge development change for the United States. But both experiences, I wouldn't trade them for anything. It was great. It was sometimes exhausting. And there were days that I sort of asked myself, how did I get here? Right? But it was terrific. I'm really proud to have done it.
When you are president and you want something done, is it very easy, or does the administration have also, I mean, the bureaucracy has its own way of working?
It's interesting. I think that's the perception, right? That the government is very, very bureaucratic. My finding was a bit different, I think. Number one, I developed a tremendous respect for the men and women who work for the government as the civil service or the foreign service. That, like the military, they serve every administration. They've got the historical knowledge. My experience was that if you show them support and respect, you can get a whole lot done. If, as a political appointee, you come in and think that you are superior, you won't get so much done. So, and on the bureaucracy, of course there's bureaucracy, but if you learn what the rules are and the systems are, you can maneuver through it. So yeah, bureaucracy was a problem, but I think before I served in government, you anticipate bureaucracy as this big, slow, massive rock that nobody can get through. And I actually feel like I was able to get a lot done for both presidents.
And the way, when you are working near the president, the way in which you see the problems, does it evolve? I mean, the situation in Africa, all the sickness, all the epidemics, everything which doesn't go well. Since you started in Africa, has the situation gone better for the worse? How would you say that?
You know, I think in many ways it's like any other region of the world, that there are things you can point to where maybe things are worse or not better enough. And there are cases where things are better. And I think, you know, even with the Ebola epidemic that we saw in 2014 or what we've seen with COVID, on the flip side, you look at the progress on HIV and AIDS and malaria and TB, and it's unbelievable. Because I remember when, you know, the first stories were coming out about the impact of HIV in Africa and other parts of the world, and it was a terrifying picture. And I think that what George Bush did when he announced a huge initiative on HIV and AIDS, President Obama basically tripled that and expanded it dramatically. And some very good health ministers and health workers on the ground in Africa. The incidence, the prevalence of that disease has been cut in half. Deaths have been cut in half. It's not done yet, but that's progress. So I guess I would generally say I think things have moved forward, but it doesn't mean that there aren't still problems.
Relations with African governments?
Between what? Relations between the United States? Or?
Yeah, the United States and the work you have to do there?
I think there's a lot more work to be done on that front. I think the relationship between the United States and Africa is deepening, but I think it needs to go both deeper and more broad. I mean, look, Africa is obviously not one country, it's a lot of countries. There's a lot of unity, but there's a lot of diversity. So I think there's a lot of room for that relationship to grow.
You have also been nominated by President Obama as administrator for the Agency for International Development, USAID.
Right.
This is a very important position. You have a lot of funding, you can do many things. When you are in that position, do you have the time to think about all the problems which are occurring in Africa? How do you do to focus on one and maybe not forget the other?
It's challenging, and it's a big agency.
Yes.
It was a budget of...
It's the biggest in the world.
It was a budget of $23 billion and a staff of just over 11,000 people. So that's big. Fortunately, it's a very, very good staff. And so there's a lot of work being done across the board that as administrator you get involved with, but we've got very good teams out there doing the work. Now, it's not the case that you become the head of that agency and you have $23 billion and you say, I'm going to do this and this and this. We have a Congress that has many priorities that are enshrined in our legislation. So some of the money is earmarked before it even comes to the agency. And then there's administration priorities. So some of it is kind of pre-directed. I think the challenge, when I was USAID administrator, and I think it's still the case today, is that balancing the response to a number of emergencies that we're seeing around the world with the investment we need to make in the resilience so that people and countries can withstand those shocks when they occur, if that makes sense. And we're seeing a lot more humanitarian crises today every year. They just build up in number and size. And, you know, the danger is we're spending so much on the response that we're not investing enough in the resilience that's needed, because we're going to get shocks like, you know, climate shocks,
And terrorism.
Invasion of Ukraine shocks, terrorism shocks.
Terrorism was also on the agenda when you started there?
Sure.
In a big way?
In a big way. I mean, I think, look, it was on the agenda in a big way for a lot of governments, African governments also. And, you know, having 2 embassies bombed in 1998, that kind of stuck with people. That was a pretty significant thing, and the risk of terrorism was and remains a very real one. Now, that wasn't my direct area of responsibility, but it was something, if you're thinking about how a society works, where you can invest and support people to build a stronger, more resilient country or community, you've got to factor those pieces in. So it made the job more complex, but certainly it was an issue.
Yeah. And last year, when it was announced that you would be the coordinator of the global COVID response, did you have to work with President Trump?
No, this was after President Trump. This was after President Biden was elected, and his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who I've worked with several times in the past, asked if I would come to the State Department and coordinate the international response. So I agreed to go back into government for a 3rd time.
So what was that kind of job of coordinating? Was it shipping the vaccine to a place or another?
Well, it was 2 things.
Funding?
2 things. First, well, we had some funding, interestingly, with the bipartisan support of Congress. Both parties had supported the funding. And I think my role with a team of people across agencies was to move the United States into a position of sharing vaccines, because we had a lot of vaccines. There was a huge demand for vaccines. So we built a system so that we could share more vaccines, and ultimately we bought 500 million and then another 500 million to share with the rest of the world. So that was one part. The second was focusing on how the U.S. government, and particularly the State Department, can position itself for what we call global health security. How do we prevent and prepare for future threats like COVID, which we know are going to occur? So what do we need to do to be ready for that, to quite frankly respond better than I think the world responded to COVID?
COVID has not disappeared.
No, it has not disappeared. We're probably heading into another surge. And, you know, my biggest concern is that we will get another variant. This is a smart virus. It's a really, really smart virus.
And you are leaving tomorrow for Washington. What
I am.
is on your desk starting tomorrow or the next?
Well, starting tomorrow, first is laundry. I've been traveling for some time. But as regards the One campaign, we are focused in the next few weeks on a couple of big events which are going to, we think, have some big impact. One is the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF. And there's been a call for, and it's one we support, for modernizing these institutions so that they can be more responsive and faster at a time when we've got food security crisis, a pandemic that isn't over, climate change, all of these crises. And then also the G20 summit will occur. They will take on some of those same issues. And we like to use our advocacy to try to pressure, encourage, drive, push decision makers at big meetings like that to take the right decisions. So those will be the immediate things on the table.
Thank you very much for having been our guest at
my pleasure.
Welcome back anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you very much,
My
Gayle
pleasure to
Smith.
be here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for listening. Au revoir. Merci beaucoup.
Do you have a minute? I'm late. Word on the streets, the pandemic's over. What?
Cases are moving up again at a rapid pace.
The pandemic is far from over.
5 million people have now died from the virus.
We're all sick of this pandemic. I'm sick of this pandemic. And look, in 30 seconds, I'm going to tell you the 5 things the world needs to do to get rid of it. Number 1, meet the global demand for vaccines. A lot of people in a lot of countries are still waiting to be vaccinated. Number 2, if we're going to live with the virus, then people need the tools to live with the virus. Testing, diagnostics. Number 3, solve the access to medicines problem. We've got treatments, we need to make sure everybody's got access. Number 4, let's make this a truly global, like everybody, economic recovery. 5th and finally, while we're at it, let's please prepare for the next one because we know there's going to be another one. So that's it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Do it now. The pandemic will go away and we'll be ready for the next one. So, any questions on this? If so, put them in the comments and I'll get back to you.